Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. I wanted to talk about the subject of Judaism and Jewry. First, to distinguish between them, and second, to discuss them in a bit of detail, given my limitations. And those limitations are considerable. First, Judaism is a religion. It is the religion of my birth, the religion of my parents. My parents were not religious Jews at all. They did not belong to a temple or synagogue or a community center. They could have, but they didn't. They said it was because of the expense that may be a part of it, but there are also ways they could have joined on a sliding income, but they chose not to for reasons of their own. And that was their decision, and it was none of my business. They obviously had no real interest in becoming a member of a Jewish temple. Okay. So Judaism is a very varied religion. It is a religion which consists of a number of different movements. The term movement is roughly equivalent to the term denomination in Christianity. And there are several movements, and the number is actually more than what it would appear to be, and I will explain that. Let's start with orthodoxy. Orthodoxy, sometimes called Torah Judaism, is not a single movement. It consists of many different movements. There are different Orthodox organizations with different approaches to orthodoxy. For example, the modern Orthodox are not as strict in practice, generally, as are the more traditional Orthodox. Sometimes the modern Orthodox are referred to as the Yeshiva University Orthodox. It is named after Yeshiva University, obviously, which is a university in uptown Manhattan. I've been on their campus. It's a very nice campus. They basically wanted to figure out a way to make it possible to be a Jew, an Orthodox Jew, back in the 20th century, now in the 21st century, without having to give up the American way of life, since it was started as an American movement. Obviously, that could be expanded to a Western way of life, but originally it was specifically a movement that was initiated in the U.S. Then let's go on to Hasidim, also called in English Hasidism. The root word in Hebrew is Hasid, which means pious. And Hasidic Jews are Jews which believe or believed originally that many Orthodox Jews had become so involved in ritual, in laws, in following the details of Jewish ritual law and procedure, that they had lost the spirit, the pious spirit of Judaism. And so the objective of orthodoxy was to bring back that pious spirit. Now, whether they have been successful can be debated. I have only been to one Hasidic service. I can tell you about what happened. The expectation I had was that it would be pious, because I thought Hasidic Jews were pious. It was not very pious. I'm not saying that people did anything that was sacrilegious, but certainly it did not confirm my expectations, put it that way. During the service, the rabbi and the cantor, the singer, were carrying the Torah, and as they were carrying the Torah, they were engaging in small talk, discussing things that had literally nothing whatsoever to do with Judaism. It was like they were simply going through the motions. They were simply going through the motions. So this kind of, I'm not sure if degeneration is the right word, that might be too harsh, but this kind of loss of spirit that originally the Hasidic Jews were so critical of mainstream Orthodox Jews for, has at least crept into that one branch, or at least that one service that I went to of the Lubavitcher Hasidim. They are a rather unusual branch of Hasidim, because they believe that their late rabbi, Rebbe Schneerson, was the Messiah, the Mashiach. Why they are still regarded as Jews or accepted as Jews by other Orthodox and Hasidic Jews is something which I have never understood. I mean, isn't that what Jesus claimed, that he was the Mashiach? And that resulted in a split, ultimately, between Judaism and Christianity. No such split has taken place because of Rebbe Schneerson. The Lubavitcher Chabad are still very much a part of the Hasidic community, albeit a rather odd one. There is another branch called Nanech, which is a branch of the movement started by Rabbi Nachman. And it started in the early 20th century in a rather odd way. The guy who was the head of this one temple claimed that he had received a letter from heaven. Those were his words, or at least his words translated into English. Now, the letter claimed to be written by Rabbi Nachman, the founder of that particular dynasty, Hasidic dynasty, as it's called. And the head of that particular congregation accepted it and believed that the letter actually was written by Rabbi Nachman. And an entire new, I guess you would say, sub-movement started based upon that letter. Later on, one of the members of that Rebbe's congregation came forward. It wasn't exactly an apology, but close. He said that, look, I was the one who wrote the letter and put it so that our rabbi would find it. I wrote the letter because our rabbi seemed to be depressed. And I thought that this letter might cheer him up, and it certainly did that. But he said that the letter was not legitimate. I wrote it. He admitted it. He admitted that he wrote it. That did not dissuade the founder of that particular sub-movement. And the Nanachs still exist. When you go to Tel Aviv, for example, which I have never done personally, when you go to parts of Brooklyn, the Nanachs are out there in full force, singing variations of the Nanach song. If you go onto YouTube and look up Nanach, it's two words, Nanach, you can find renderings of that song by members of Nanach. So, as you see, there's a lot of variation, not only within Orthodox Judaism, but within a branch of Orthodox Judaism called Hasidim. It is a very difficult movement to understand because Orthodoxy is really more like Protestantism than it is like Roman Catholicism, meaning that although Orthodox accept each other as legitimate, that is not true with all Protestants, but it is true with Orthodox. There is not just one Orthodox organization. There are many, and they are each run by different organizations and different people, and they all have their own ideas of what Orthodoxy should be like. And generally speaking, the view of Orthodox Jews is that if you are not Orthodox, you are not practicing Judaism. The only authentic Judaism to most Orthodox Jews is Orthodoxy. Period. End of story. If you are anything else, you may be Jewish if you are born of a Jewish mother, but you are not engaged in the practice of the religion of Judaism. Okay. Directly below is a relatively small movement. It's called the traditionalist movement. Historically, it was sometimes called conservadox, which meant that it was a blending of orthodoxy and the movement directly below rather, the traditionalists, called the conservative movement. So it's kind of a hybrid of orthodoxy and conservatism, meaning it's not quite orthodox, but it's also not quite conservative. But it came out of the right wing of the conservative movement. In fact, that's what it was originally. Eventually, some people who were called conservadox decided that they would start their own separate movement, and that was the beginning of the traditionalist movement. But there are, on the other hand, still some conservadox Jews who have not formally identified with traditionalism. Why? Well, I think there are a number of reasons. One is the relatively small size of traditionalism. There aren't that many traditionalists around. There aren't that many traditionalist congregations around. I don't know exactly how many there are, but they're relatively few. And so it is likely that if you live in a Jewish area, there is not going to be a traditional congregation near you. So by sheer necessity, those people on the right wing of the conservative movement remain in conservatism because there's no way of joining, in a formal sense, a traditionalist temple or synagogue. Okay, so that's another movement, and arguably it's the newest major movement within Judaism. As I alluded to, the movement directly below traditionalist is the conservative movement. The conservative movement was actually the second movement established after orthodoxy. The idea behind it was that they wanted to hold on to most elements of orthodoxy, but they were also willing to make compromises, meaning that they did not necessarily insist, for example, that Jews follow all the details of Jewish ritual. So many conservative Jews do not. Now they may come close, but not entirely. And for that reason, conservatism is not recognized as a legitimate form of Judaism by Orthodox Jews. That's the way it's been. After conservatism came the Reform movement. The Reform movement is the name given to that movement in the United States. In most of the world, it is called the liberal movement. These are Jews who basically believe in something like an open canon, that who's to say that the Jewish canon ended with the Talmud? Why can't there be an open canon? A canon that is still possibly able to be interpreted in the 21st century. So it's a canon which is open to constant and continual reservations. Obviously, that was a very controversial idea. A lot of conservative and Orthodox Jews did not take very kindly to that. And yet, the Reform movement is now a very large movement in Judaism. In fact, one of the smallest movements is Orthodoxy. The smallest is traditionalism, but Reform is much, much larger, much, much larger. I don't know exactly what my parents were, since my parents never attended or belonged to a temple. I am not even sure what the movement was that my Hebrew school teacher belonged to, since his Hebrew school was run out of his home. He built an extension onto his home, which was literally a few blocks from where we lived in Bayside, Queens, which is a borough of New York City. He was a really nice guy. His name was Joel Bernstein. We all liked him. He would give us silver stars for getting things right. And if we got a sufficient number of silver stars, he would give us gifts like walkie-talkies and, I don't know, shortwave radios and things like that. So we all liked him because he would give us stuff. I guess giving people stuff makes you like them. And Joel would do that. Well, we called him Mr. Bernstein, but now I call him Joel. Why not? Joel would do that for us. And I loved Joel. I thought Joel was a magnificent man. So that even after my bar mitzvah, I wanted to continue attending his Hebrew school, which I did for a short time, maybe only a couple of months. I'm not sure exactly why I stopped. Maybe I lost interest. I don't know what happened, but I did go for a brief period. Joel let me go without paying any money. He didn't care. I think he was happy that I was interested. So he let me continue attending without paying him any fees. And but I was kind of an outsider because I was not one of the people preparing for his bar mitzvah anymore. I was not eligible to get the stars and to get the gifts. So in a sense, I was in a place where I really didn't belong. I liked Joel. I liked Joel's sense of humor. I liked his approach to teaching Judaism in his own way. But I really didn't fit in Joel Bernstein's Hebrew school after I was bar mitzvahed. I remember my bar mitzvah. And I remember the beginning of my Haftorah, which is what you recite during your bar mitzvah. I remember it began Veher Beisi Esperi. That's about all I can recall. But I knew it then. That was a long time ago. I'm now almost 68. At that time, I was 13. So the fact that I remember even that little bit, I'm happy about. Anyway, that's the reform movement. I have a particular liking for the reform movement, and it's mostly because of Joel. Admittedly, more than the reform movement per se, it's because I liked Joel so much. Okay, after reform came what is known as the Reconstructionist movement. The Reconstructionist movement, like the Traditionalist movement, came out of conservatism. Okay, so they both were derivatives of the conservative movement, but in very different ways. As the Traditionalist movement or conservadox movement was the right wing of conservative Judaism. Reconstructionism was the left wing of conservative Judaism. So their idea was and remains that Judaism should be properly defined as an evolving Jewish civilization. Interesting idea. Some people have assumed incorrectly that Reconstructionism is atheistic. It is not at all. But because Reconstructionism was so different than any other branch of Judaism before it, including Reform, many people just found it hard to accept. And I can understand why. I respect it. I think defining Judaism as an evolving Jewish civilization makes a certain level of sense, and I will explain why in a second. But I can also see why some people might find that to be offensive. I can. Now, here is why I think it makes sense, and why I think that the Reconstructionists are really the only Jewish movement to get it right. I'm not saying I agree with them. I don't practice Judaism anymore. But in the context of Judaism, I think that they understood what Judaism was, what Judaism is right now as well. Many people assume that Orthodox Judaism, or really Orthodox Judaisms, as they are practiced today, are identical with the Judaism that was practiced in biblical times. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be further from the truth at all. Judaism, biblical Judaism, ended in 70 AD. Why? That was the time of the destruction of the Second Jewish Temple. Tithes were paid to the Jewish temple. All the records of ancestry were in the Jewish temple. My father told me that we were Levites, but that's based upon oral tradition. There is no historical evidence, meaning written evidence, that we are Levites. Maybe we are, but there's no way to prove it. There's no documentation for it. The documentation existed in the Second Temple. So that was gone. Then there was the diaspora, the dispersion. Jews dispersed throughout the world, even to places like China and Japan. Most notably, though, to Central Europe, which is my ancestry, so-called Ashkenazi Jews, to Southern Europe, mostly around Spain. Those are called Sephardic Jews. And the Middle East, those are called Mizrahi Jews. But there are a lot of others as well. I am leaving out a lot. I am only scratching the surface. So there are a lot of different places where Jews went because they had to. They were gone. They had no place to live anymore. They were exiled, and they moved around the world. And so different types of Judaism developed in those different parts of the world. Now, are there some parallels? Some. There are some parallels, for example, between Ashkenazi and Sephardi or Sephardic Jews. But there are also differences. For example, the language. The language principally spoken by Ashkenazi Jews was Yiddish, which is a German dialect written in Hebrew letters with a lot of Hebrew words mixed in with it. On the other hand, Sephardi Judaism, their major language was Ladino, also written in Hebrew letters, but it is basically a Spanish dialect with a lot of Hebrew words incorporated into it. So Judaism is a very complex religion. It's not as simple as most people assume. The idea, for example, that in order to be considered to be Jewish at birth, one has to have a Jewish mother. Well, that's true, but it's only true among Orthodox, traditionalist, and conservative Jews. Others, like Reform and Reconstructionist, don't have that requirement. So even if your father is Jewish, but your mother was not, you are still considered as being Jewish. And of course, a person can convert to being Jewish as well, like Ivanka Trump did, because she married a Jewish man, Jared Trump. And whether she believes in Judaism, I don't know. Maybe she does. You know, I've never interviewed her. It's none of my business anyway. But regardless, she converted to Judaism. She had no choice. Another mistake people make, that all Orthodox Jews are super religious. That's not true. Many Orthodox Jews are basically secular Jews. They live completely non-religious lives. Many of them don't follow the kosher laws, and many of them hardly, if ever, attend temple. So why are they Orthodox? It goes back to that song from Fiddler on the Roof. Tradition, tradition, okay, tradition. Their family was Orthodox, so they are Orthodox as well. So it is not a matter of belief necessarily. It is a matter of your family background. And that often determines what branch of Judaism, including Orthodox, which you would not assume that you would fall into. So that's a brief synopsis of Judaism. And it is a superficial synopsis because, again, I left Judaism when I was 14 years old and converted to another religion, which I will not mention, at least not at this time, not relevant to this discussion. But I did leave Judaism formally. According to Orthodox Jews, maybe traditionalists as well, I'm not sure. But at least according to Orthodox Jews, because I was born the son of a Jewish mother, I am still Jewish. The fact that I converted out of it to another religion does not make me a non-Jew. But to Reconstructionist, Reform, and conservative Jews, the fact that I converted to another religion means that I am no longer Jewish. So basically, I have my pick. Since I don't belong to Judaism anymore, it doesn't really matter to me. So if I say I'm Jewish, that's right from a conservative, rather a Orthodox perspective. If I say I'm not Jewish, that's also right from an Orthodox, from a conservative, Reconstructionist, and Reform perspective. So, in other words, it's open-ended. There's no real definitive answer to those kinds of questions. There's no real way of answering it. Judaism is a very varied religion. It is not fixed at all. Many people who are not Jews assume it is. Assume that, for example, that all Jews believe in God. Nothing could be further from the truth. Especially here in the US, where a large number of Jews are atheists. I have said that to people, and they have literally said, I don't believe you. Okay, fine, don't believe me. I'm right. They can not believe me if they want, but I'm still right. My mother was an atheist for a while. I don't know if she died an atheist, maybe, maybe not. My father always said he was not an atheist, but he was not practicing really until he lived in an assisted living facility, and then once a month, a rabbi would come by, I'm not even sure from what Jewish movement, and conduct services, and he would attend those services at least for as long as he was able. He rapidly developed severe dementia. At that point, he was no longer able to do that. So, but at least for a short time, he did attend Jewish services. Growing up, we did not do that. My family did not attend Jewish services, even high holy day services. What about Passover and Hanukkah? Yeah, when I was a little kid, we did. We lit the Hanukkah candles. We had Passover seders, but only for like 3 or 4 years. That was about it. That's about the state of American Judaism, especially in New York City, which is the largest Jewish city in the world, larger than Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Now, Israel has the largest Jewish population of any country, but it is followed in close second place by the United States. So you can argue, depending upon what your priorities are, that either Israel or the United States is the center of global Judaism. And there really is no surefire answer to that question. Either answer can be true depending upon your presuppositions. Okay, so that's basically my brief and probably flawed discussion of what Judaism is. Now, Jewry. Jewry can also be called in Yiddish, Yiddishkeit. It means the way of life of Jews. Jews and how they live. Living a Jewish way of life. Was my family Yiddishkeit? No. I was exposed to Yiddishkeit in Hebrew school a bit. I had some friends, sort of friends, family friends, who practiced Yiddishkeit in their homes. What is Yiddishkeit? Well, that's a good question. I am not entirely sure. Basically, it means a fidelity to Jewish culture, a belief in Jewish culture, attempting to hold on to that culture in some way or some ways, whether that means going to a Jewish camp, whether that means singing Jewish songs, whether that means gathering around to discuss Jewish topics at home. It can mean any one of those things and more. Any of those things can be Yiddishkeit, and I guess would make that person a part of global Jewry. So the question is, even though my parents were Jews and my family was a Jewish family when I was growing up, were we a part of Jewry? I don't know what the answer to that question is either. I simply don't know. Maybe, maybe not. If I had to give an answer right now on the spot, I would say no, because we didn't really practice any Jewish ceremonies. Now, I'm not talking about following the religion. I'm talking about the kinds of traditional practices which have developed as a part of Jewish culture. That's all. That's what Yiddishkeit is. It's Jewish culture. And either you know what that culture is or you don't. I know what it is because I was exposed to it, even though my parents were not really a part of it. There are some aspects of Yiddishkeit that I like, and there are some aspects of it that I don't like. I'll give you one example of each. A part that I like, the strong emphasis on the family. I like that. It's nice. In fact, it was that strong emphasis on the family which brought Jews and Italians together when they immigrated into New York City and separated those same Jews and Italians from the Irish. Of course, Irish were Roman Catholic for the most part. Italians also, for the most part, were Roman Catholic, but they hated each other. They literally hated each other. Why? Well, if you can't figure it out, I'll tell you. The Irish spoke English. The Italians did not. Neither did the Jews. That bonded the Italians and the Jews together. But it put the Irish one step higher. That meant that they could get better jobs. One of those better jobs was working as a police officer. That's why in so many older movies, you see the police officer as Irish. And that was based on actual events, because there were a lot of police officers in the United States who were Irish. Because even though they might not have an education, they might not even have graduated high school, back then, that was not a prerequisite. They spoke English. That's what mattered. So they were able to become police officers. For the most part, Jews and Italians spoke very little, if any, English. And so they really could not become police officers. Commonly, Jews would often open Jewish delicatessens, or become professional boxers. I had a grandfather who was a professional boxer, in addition to the fact that he owned a chain of supermarkets. He was actually a wealthy man in his time. For Italians, well, many Italians became owners of pizzerias. That was a very common job for Italians. Also, barbers. Those were two of the major jobs that Italian immigrants got, at least in New York City. So, Italians and Jews had in common that they were, in a sense, the subaltern. They were the outcasts. They were the marginalized members of American, especially New York City society. Italians, you could argue, were marginalized to an extent, but not as marginalized as Jews and Italians, because they spoke English and therefore they could get the better jobs. So, Yiddishkeit, getting back to that subject, is basically a fidelity to the culture of Jews. It has nothing necessarily to do with practicing Judaism as a religion. Now, it can. Certainly, a person can be both Yiddishkeit and belong to one or more of the movements of Judaism, but belonging to a Jewish movement is not a prerequisite for being Yiddishkeit. And most early Jewish families, first generation Jewish immigrants, were Yiddishkeit. Is that true anymore? Not that much. Not as much. So, where did Yiddishkeit come from? For that matter, where did Judaism, as we define it now, come from? It came, for the most part, in talking about most American Jews from the ghetto. That is where most Jews lived. In Central Europe and the areas around Central Europe, on the ghetto. And at various points in history, they were forced to live on the ghetto. They had no choice. In some cases, they were made to wear these pointy hats. Talk about bigotry, as signs that they were Jews and that they lived on the ghetto. So, at that time, what we now think of as Orthodox Judaism, which again developed after 70 AD on the Jewish ghetto, at that time, it made sense. For example, even today, if you practice Orthodox Judaism, as well as some branches of conservative Judaism, and I assume all branches of traditional or conservadox Judaism, you cannot drive on the Sabbath, or in Hebrew, the Shabbos. You can't drive on that day. You can't even turn on any lights based upon an interpretation of the Tanakh, of the Old Testament, made in the Talmud. Obviously, the Tanakh never says you can't turn on lights. Why? Because there were no lights. There was no electricity. There were no cars. So all of that is interpretive. It's not really based upon anything specific that you can point to in the Tanakh. Now, say I, a guy living in Mission, Texas, 2 miles north of the Mexican border, wanted to practice Orthodox Judaism. I couldn't do it. Or even conservative Judaism. I couldn't do it. The nearest conservative or Orthodox temple to me is about 5 hours away. There is a Reform temple, which I think is about maybe an hour away by car. But again, if I were Orthodox, I couldn't drive there anyway. So what may have made sense back on the Jewish ghetto, arguably, and again, I'm just giving you my own thoughts, arguably does not make sense in 2023, because you simply can't do it. If you want to practice Orthodox Judaism, you have to live in the same neighborhood as other Jews do, with a temple in that neighborhood. Otherwise, you can't practice it. You can't practice it online because you can't use the internet on the Sabbath or on Shabbos. So it puts people who want to practice Orthodox Judaism, but who do not live in a Jewish neighborhood, in a very precarious situation. Namely, they cannot they literally cannot practice Orthodox Judaism. If I wanted to, and I don't, but say I were to convert back to Orthodox Judaism, even though I never was an Orthodox Jew, but say I converted to Orthodox Judaism, it would be meaningless because I couldn't do it. I couldn't remain where I live. I would have to move someplace else, into some Jewish neighborhood in some other city far from me, so I can practice it. That would be my only option. I would have literally no other option. That is the problem with modern Orthodox Judaism, and why some critics of it, including me, will often refer to Orthodox Judaism as ghetto Judaism, and not entirely as an insult, although I guess it could be interpreted that way, but as a realistic description of what Orthodox Judaism requires. That you basically live in a ghetto. And if you don't live in a ghetto, you can't practice the religion. Okay, now let's take all this and bring this back into a Maoist, third worldist perspective, as best as I can. This is one of the hard ones, but I will try. Arguably, you can say that Jews in the United States, on one level, not on all levels, but on one level, occupy the subaltern. Why? Well, it's not because Jews are necessarily constant targets of anti-Semitism. That would not be true. The level of anti-Semitism in the US, while increasing, is certainly nowhere near what it used to be. But still, to be Jewish in the 21st century is to be marginalized. You are marginalized from the rest of society if you choose to practice Orthodox Judaism, or if you choose to engage to an extreme extent in Yiddishkeit. Now, do either of those things apply to me? No. Am I subaltern? No. So not all American Jews would be subaltern. That's why I'm saying it's difficult. But some would be. Some would be. Like, for example, the case of the hypothetical Jew who wants to be Orthodox, but who can't because he or she lives hours away from an Orthodox temple. That person would be seen, or could be seen, I think, as being marginalized. Now, I have not discussed the third world here, and I'm really not qualified to discuss Judaism in the third world. I know it exists. I know, for example, that there are Jews who live in Palestine, who have been there for a long time. They have nothing to do with Israeli Jews. They are Palestinian Jews. Do I know anything about them? No. I have no knowledge about them whatsoever. So my ability to have an intelligent dialogue with anyone on Judaism in the third world is nil. I can't do it. I would like to, but I don't have the education. I don't have that background. But I can talk about Jews in the United States that I have known, not directly, not in my own life, but people I have known who were Jewish, who wanted to practice Orthodoxy, but who could not do so because of their physical location. So that would be an example of the subaltern in American Judaism. With that, I will end it. This has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.